Harry get his visa revoked? What is the story with William's secret Ukraine mission? And does the King have sibling problems of his own? Well, I'm Jo Elvin and this is Palace Confidential. On my panel today to discuss all the big royal talking points, we have the Mail on Sunday's assistant editor Kate Middleton and the Daily Mail's diary editor Richard Eden. Welcome to you both. Now, before we start, a reminder that if you are enjoying our shows and clips, make sure you click the like and subscribe buttons below, and that way you won't miss any of our fantastic royal coverage. We will get to Harry's visa row in a little bit, but let's kick things off with the Prince of Wales flying very close to a war zone. Kate, this one obviously involved a lot of secrecy and security. What can you tell us now about it?
Well, so Kensington Palace obviously swore us all to secrecy. There's a few people who were allowed to know because some of the journalists travelled out there to see his trip. So he went out to the border, near to the border with Ukraine. So he was visiting troops, Polish troops and British troops who are working together to support Ukraine. And he flew out yesterday. It was all a big surprise. And then at 5 o'clock, the embargo lifted. He's been out there chatting away. Today, he's going to visit President Duda. He's in Warsaw looking at a food hall where he'll be meeting Ukrainian refugees. And this is the first time a royal has made such an intervention in the Ukraine conflict. It's really interesting. We've heard such warm words from the King, haven't we, about support for Ukraine and how it's important that Western allies all kind of help. But this mission and this visit, I think, is such a really powerful message of support for the country.
I didn't know that journalists could be trusted with such big state secrets. Were you?
Well, you remember, of course, that journalists kept the secret of Harry going to Afghanistan. And it was only when it emerged, I think, in an Australian publication that the security was breached and Harry had to be oiked out.
I was very firmly living in Britain at that point. I'd just like to point out. I mean, William will obviously be visiting Poland at the request of the British government. But this is a matter close to his heart, isn't it?
I think it really is. I mean, what we've seen already is the Prince and Princess of Wales in Britain visiting people affected by Ukraine conflict, whether that's refugees. A few weeks ago, they were at the Ukrainian Cultural Centre and they were seeing the efforts that have gone to send support to Ukraine. But to actually get there very close to the border and be meeting people, I think it's what the royal family does best. You know, they're the symbol of our country. It will be getting a lot of international attention as well, and I think it's a really heartening move.
But Kate, as you know, now the heir apparent to the throne, and the more senior he is in the royal family, these kind of trips will inevitably invite more spotlight and scrutiny, won't they?
That's right. I think he has more power now. As a Prince of Wales, you know, he's visiting as a kind of very soon to be head of state at some point as the next in line to the throne. But also the security would have been top notch. You know, make sure that what would happen if we lost William. You know.
But I suppose the trips that he chooses to do as well, they make more of a statement than when he was the Duke of Cambridge. Is that fair?
That's right. I mean, I think this time last year they were in the Caribbean and there was that kind of, it was very controversial, that trip. And I think now they have to play it very, very carefully. Where are they going to go? How is the message going to be perceived? And next week, of course, we've got the King and Queen Consort in France and Germany for their first foreign state visit. So that will be interesting too because of the protests in France and everything that's going on there, protests against Macron and some of the politics involved. So they'll be flying into that. That will definitely be one to watch next week.
Well,
I'll be going out on Sunday for that.
Well, enjoy. We'll be covering it here, I'm absolutely sure. So, Richard, let's follow up now on a story we discussed last week. The King's siblings. What a dramatic bunch they are. I mean, but at the weekend we saw pictures of Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, out riding with Andrew, Duke of York. Well, what did you make of that?
I thought it was a lovely photograph. It was, it looked like Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, and Prince Andrew had noticed the photographer. I have to say, they were looking at the camera and they looked to be happy to be seen. And remember that when you go out riding in Windsor Great Park, there is an expectation that you might be seen.
As one does, yes. Tell us what you know about riding in Great Windsor Park, Richard.
I've never done it myself, but when you go out there, you know that you might bump into members of the public and you might also see the odd photographer, hiding behind a tree or something. So what this says clearly is that Prince Edward is happy to be photographed with his brother. And to me, it does show that they want to support him. Obviously, it's poor Duke of York is kind of trapped in this no man's land where he's wanting to get back and do something useful, and he's at the moment not allowed to do that. Last week we discussed his ex-wife Fergie, who's been in America promoting her book. So I think it's a powerful signal from his siblings that they want to support him, and I think they would like him to have some sort of useful role again.
How do you view it, Kate? Do you think it's a sort of question of it's Charles and then there's the siblings? Do you think that there's a bit of a divide there?
I think, yeah. I mean, in a family where one's always going to be top dog, which is, quite unusual, isn't it? That he was always going to be king. The others were always going to be less important, so say, in the order of succession. But I thought the pictures were quite charming, actually, because Edward has always been a bridge between Charles and Andrew, naturally slightly closer to Charles than Andrew, and has always managed to kind of keep that kind of running quite smoothly. Now, we've not seen Edward riding in Windsor for a long time, and now that he's Duke of Edinburgh, I think he's feeling a bit more settled and obviously very pleased to have that dukedom. So I expect he's, that Charles has made, given him a gift in that respect, that he's promoted him to the dukedom, and he's probably feeling better about it, everything. And yeah,
that must be utterly exhausting, being the diplomat, running the gamut between those two.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you've got Andrew clinging on into Royal Lodge, Charles saying, you can't stay there, mate, you've got to move over to Frogmore Cottage, which actually was the Queen's decision before she died, which I don't think many people realise. It was her decision that Andrew should move into Frogmore Cottage.
Well, speaking of Frogmore, Kate, also a word on your story from the weekend about another twist in the tale of Frogmore.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So Frogmore Cottage was the property that the Queen allowed Harry and Meghan to use as their official residence after they were married. They moved out of Kensington Palace, a bit of a distance between them and Kate and William, and set up home in Frogmore Cottage. They had to do quite a lot of work to that cottage, 2.4 million it turns out, to renovate it. And they smushed lots of different properties into one big one, and made it nice for them, nice family home. That was public money. So when they left the royal family, Buckingham Palace put out a statement pretty soon, pretty early days, saying it was their wish, Harry and Meghan's wish, that they would pay that money back, so they could be held to account. Indeed, they did pay the money back, and my story at the weekend showed that they paid that 2.4 million lump sum, but what we had all, I think, expected was that they would then pay a commercial rate. We'd expected that because initially that's what the palace had said. Now it transpires that, in fact, they didn't have to pay any more monthly payments after that, because the money they spent reimbursing the taxpayer on the property raised the value of the property to such an extent that it counted as basically rent in lieu. So this was the fact that, OK, you've paid that 2.4 million, we'll call it quits. You've raised the value of the property, you've done all this work, you've paid for it because you've reimbursed the taxpayer. So we don't, we'll leave that there. And it was quite interesting because touching a push pressure points with the palace on anything to do with the Sussexes is really, really difficult. But I think ultimately it's public money, and how a deal was struck to repay that public money. And some people might think, well, 2.4 million, fair enough. They've paid that money back, and that's a lot of money, and they've barely lived there. So why should they pay any more rent?
Well, also, this must have made it particularly annoying for Harry and Meghan that they've been told they have to leave, because if they were essentially staying there rent-free now, having paid off that money, it was a nice little number for them, wasn't it? So I'm sure that will add to their annoyance.
I don't know. They've been very quiet about leaving, and interestingly, when I had the story, I went back to Harry's autobiography, and it's not really mentioned in there. So I think they're probably fine. I think they were probably happy to be rid of it. I don't know if they ever really felt very much at home there. Certainly they didn't stay very long, did they?
Yeah, I never got the impression that they really liked it.
No. No.
Anyway, let's move on. Let's hear some of your comments now. And HDYU makes a point about the royal family dynamics and says, I think the problem for King Charles is that he doesn't have a consort that can deal with the family problems as Queen Elizabeth had Prince Philip. As much as Queen Camilla supports King Charles, she can't step in that way. King Charles should ask the Princess Royal to sort the family relations out. Well, that's something we've discussed a lot, isn't it? That maybe it's time to bring in Anne as the diplomat, or perhaps Edward's dealing with it all?
It's a very tricky one, though, isn't it? Can you imagine? I mean, it does highlight that, that correspondent highlights the difficulty whereas before Queen Elizabeth was head of the family and also, head of the institution. But now, because he's one of the siblings, it's a much more awkward relationship, and I don't think he could just hand it over to Princess Anne and say,
I'd love to see that.
You're in charge of family relations, thank you.
I'd love to see Princess Anne as the enforcer. I think that would be a brilliant role for her. I'm not sure she'd want to do it.
No, I'm not sure she'd welcome it at all.
I think she'd do a good job of it, though.
Oh, she'd be brilliant, yeah.
Well, lots of you were very pleased to see Edward and Sophie made Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, and Abacus had this to say: Duchess of Edinburgh was a title once borne by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, so had great meaning for Prince Philip and the Queen. It's a very worthy reward for the non-royal born Sophie. What a fine, hard-working ambassador she is for the royal family, country and Commonwealth. Well, that's very, very generous of you. That's lovely. While Terry Durham, who I believe might be from Canada, writes, we need to see more of Sophie. She's beautiful and hard-working and represents the monarchy well. Well, the people want more Anne and more Sophie. So much for the King's slimmed-down monarchy, and we'll answer a couple of your questions on that subject a little later in the show. But let's get back to my panel now, and just the other week, our very own Richard Eden was wondering whether Prince Harry's open discussion of his previous drug use would have a bearing on his US visa. And well, guess what? I think the conservative think tank Heritage Foundation must be watching Palace Confidential, because they are now demanding that Harry's visa application is made public. What do you think?
Well, look, when you apply for a visa to be in any country, and it's the same if you come here, you're essentially a guest, aren't you? You might come to work or to live, and you're basically expected to be on your best behaviour. But when you move to a country, like Harry has to the USA, and then you start bringing out a book encouraging drug use, talking about how great it was for you, and then you appear in that interview with the guy the other week where, again, he was talking about the benefits of drug use. I think people in America, from what I hear, they're starting to ask, do we still want him here? Is he a guest that we welcome? And from what I can see, this is serious. Okay, it's a conservative think tank now, but there's people asking to see his application form for the visa, what he put in that. And also there's people saying, should we rethink whether we allow him to stay?
Kate, we know a lot about how much Harry hated the work of palace officials and what his mother called the men in grey suits, but it's hard to imagine them letting him get into this kind of a debacle, isn't it?
Well, I think, at the palace you have all these kind of layers of, bureaucracy, but also people there to support you to make sure anything like this doesn't happen. It kind of protects you in a way. But obviously he's chosen to go outside of that organisation for, reasons which we're all very familiar to us now because he's told us many times. But the downside is that you then don't have a lot of these kind of checks and balances and all that sort of thing, really. Yeah,
and speaking of checks and balances, Richard, similarly, there's been some controversy over a group that the Sussexes are now supporting called the Global Boyhood Initiative. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what do you know about that?
This is really interesting because it's a symbol of how Harry and Meghan are trying to sort of show their support for more radical organisations and radical ideas now that they're out of the royal family. I think they want to show how different they are. And this is an organisation which, from what I read, it's all about changing views of boyhood and manhood and that sort of thing. And where it's really caused controversy is that they've been complaining about people gendering babies in the womb, so i.e. saying I'm expecting a boy or a girl based on their sexual organs, and they're saying, oh no, well that's not an indication of what their gender will be like. It's a very trendy, these type of organisations, as we all know, they're really trendy at the moment, but they're the sort of ones that the royal family would be nervous about. And Harry and Meghan are embracing, but whether that's a good thing, I'm not sure.
Yeah, Kate, within the palace, where if they were still in the royal family, what sort of scrutiny would an organisation like this have to go through before it got a royal support?
Well, there'd been a tremendous amount of scrutiny on any charity that any member of the royal family was involved with. There'd be due diligence processes, there'd be lots of series of interviews. And interestingly, it was this cumbersome process that Harry and Meghan were kind of railing against when they wanted to go off and they wanted to make change, and they're very ambitious to make change as quickly as possible. And, to some extent you can feel for them, because that is a very slow process. The wheels turn very slowly at the palace, but for good reason, because they need to make sure that what they do is right. They need to make sure they're not getting involved with any charity which might have, any kind of dodgy connections or anything like that. I don't know much about this particular charity, but one presumes that Harry's new team has gone through a sort of similar due diligence process, and they're not putting their name to something that they'll later regret.
Well, time will tell. But Richard, I know you had some thoughts about this compared to the Princess of Wales's latest early years initiative launch.
Well, I just thought it was an interesting contrast this week. It was a big event for the Princess of Wales. It was in the City of London, just across here from us, and it was basically showing how you can get businesses involved. She's trying to kind of set standards for to help parents in the early years, when it's crucial that they can support children as much as possible, and what would benefit the children. That's what she's trying to look at. So she's trying to get as many people on board as possible, big businesses, using her influence to do that. Now, she's had a bit of criticism, is the usual sort of criticism from sort of Harry and Meghan cheerleaders who say, oh, it's just some bland thing, early years, what's that? It's some kind of, how can you make a difference? But I think they're missing the point that this is the most crucial time of anyone's life, really, is those formative years when you're small. And she's trying to do all she can to make a difference. So by bringing organisations, companies together, I think she can. And it's a great contrast with Harry and Meghan trying to choose those radical type of things, make headlines, make controversy. It's very interesting contrast, I think.
Well, let's hear a couple of your questions now. And Nikki Gray says, I'm very pleased for Edward and Sophie. Do you think King Charles is trying to tidy up the issue of titles, etc., so that things are less stressful on William when he becomes king? Kate, do you think that's an interesting point? Will William have had a role in this?
I think William is increasingly involved in a lot of those conversations, because this will be up to him at some point. So he would have been involved and kept abreast of it. But this would have been Charles's decision that the dukedom would go ultimately to Edward. There was lots of backs and forth. Would he get it? Would he not get it? And there seems to be a deal struck where he would get it, but it won't pass then on to his son. So everybody's happy for now. I think it's Charles trying to sort out his own kingship, actually, rather than setting things out for William. But obviously he'll have a mind to the future, as they always do, because they're looking, they're always looking ahead. This is a long-term project, the monarchy. So.
Well, Susan Kosnick has a different perspective that I hadn't thought of before. Isn't it possible, she asks, in light of their previous actions on titles, that Edward and Sophie did not want the Edinburgh title to be hereditary? Do you think Susan could be onto something there, Richard?
I think it's a really interesting point from her. And the truth is, we just don't know. But what we do know is that when Edward and Sophie had children, they agreed that they wouldn't have those Prince and Princess titles. Instead, it was Lady Louise and later Viscount Severn James. But that was part of a sort of process that had been agreed for this slimmed-down monarchy, where they were reducing the number of princes and princesses. So whether they wanted that or whether they were happy to go along with it, I'm not sure.
Well, my sources say that I think they had assumed that they would get the Duke and Duchess title and that it would go to James. And I think they had always, because why would you get a dukedom and then it not pass to your son? But I think this is the sticking point with the whole title, is the fact that in a few years' time, as James gets older, has his children, they have children, you've got Duke of Edinburgh title that's then so far removed from the crown, and it's a really important title. You can't have a situation where the Duke of Edinburgh is, in several generations' time so far removed so as not to be almost considered royal, that's when they put the stop to it. But in compensation for that, then James is allowed to use the Earl of Wessex title from now, immediately, because it always passes to the son, interestingly, even though we now have, the king or queenship, who's on the throne. If Charlotte had been born ahead of Prince George, she would have become queen ahead of him. But with the dukedom, it goes through the male line still, which is really interesting, because obviously James has an older sister. So
Is
anyway.
anybody else as lost as I am?
Well, I think some of our viewers probably know more about it than I do.
I'm so glad I don't have these stresses in my family.
Anyway,
life.
it's not bad to be an Earl, no? I mean, he might
I
not
don't know.
be
I'll never know.
James might not be a Duke in the future, but he's still an Earl. So.
An Earl. I remember when I was little, I thought Earl Spencer's first name was Earl. So that's where I'm at. So anyway, but a reminder that you can leave your comments and questions below. Email us at palace@mailplus.co.uk or find us on social media where we are at MailPlus. Sadly, that is all we have time for on Palace Confidential today. My thanks to Kate Manzi, Richard Eden, and to you for watching. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.